Hello and welcome. When will all the talking lead to action? That's the question critics are now asking as Washington prepares to relaunch Middle East peace talks with no real movement on key issues. Direct talks ended in 2008 after Israel launched its war on Gaza, killing more than 1,000 Palestinians. Israeli elections brought hardliner Binyamin Netanyahu back to power, and although he accepted the idea of a Palestinian state, he said it must be demilitarized. Well, 5 months after declaring a partial halt to new settlement permits, Israel announced 1,600 new settlement units in East Jerusalem. In May, an Israeli commando assault on the Turkish-owned Mavi Marmara and aid flotilla to Gaza put the two sides even further apart. So on today's show, we ask, are direct talks a legitimate attempt to peace or simply a photo op? Tell us what you think. Send your questions and comments by SMS or email or call into the program. Joining me from London is Israeli author and journalist Gideon Levy. He's just released a new book, The Punishment of Gaza, which brings together his widely read columns printed in the progressive Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Gideon Levy serves on the paper's editorial board and has covered the West Bank and Gaza for decades. Gideon, I welcome you to the show. It's really good to have you on with us.
Thank you, Riz. It's my pleasure.
Let me start by asking about these talks that are about to start in Washington, D.C. Do you really believe that anything can come out of this?
Not only anything, I think it might be also dangerous. It's another scene in this ongoing, endless masquerade, the longest peace process in history, which lasts now over 15 years. Another photo opportunity. But it's not only about what will happen if nothing will come out of it, because in any case it's better when they talk rather than when they shoot. But one has to think also what happens if it fails, and there is no reason to think that it will not fail, because failures of negotiations, we learned already in the Middle East, always lead to another bloodshed, like it was the case in the year 2000. Therefore, I'm so amazed that the parties, and above all, the American administration, does not give a thought about the possibility that this is going to fail, and it must fail because the Israeli Prime Minister, the current Israeli Prime Minister, does not believe in peace with the Palestinians, have no serious intention to do the major steps that are required, and it leads to nowhere.
Let me quote your book. You write in The Punishment of Gaza, your new book, that there really can't be any progress in the talks, of course, while Hamas is left out of the picture. And you criticize the Palestinian leadership on this. Let me quote you. You say, if Abu Mazen was a genuine national leader instead of a petty retailer, he would refuse to participate in the summit. Until the blockade of Gaza is lifted, if he were a man of truly historic stature, he would add that no conference can be held without Ismail Haniyeh. That's the Hamas leader, of course. So let me ask you then where the Palestinian leadership may be actually dividing itself further. If Abu Mazen goes to these talks, of course, it sort of more or less rules out any idea of a resolution between Hamas and Fatah, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and this is so tragic from the Palestinian point of view. I think it's fatal, the fact that they are divided. It's fatal that Gaza is divided from the West Bank and Fatah is divided from Hamas. I think they should have done much bigger effort to reunite, but this doesn't happen and doesn't seem to happen. And Israel is negotiating now with almost half the Palestinian people about almost half the Palestinian territory. This by itself is a mistake. It doesn't promise much.
Let me get a couple of emails to you we had here, Gideon. These illustrate the skepticism that many feel when they hear about peace talks. I'll read them back to back, if I may. The first is from a viewer in Turkey by the name of Sinan Çetinkaya, who says, Israel is always saying we want to negotiate peace, but after a while they attack Palestinians. When Israelis say peace, it means Palestinians will die. And the other from Saudi Arabia, from Samir Akhtar, says, meaningful dialogue is not possible as long as Israel exerts power over the Palestinians. How can a nation held hostage discuss peace in conditions that foster mistrust? In your opinion, are there any real peacemakers left in Israel that can actually be courageous, as you say, to take these steps?
No, unfortunately not. I think the Israeli left was totally smashed 10 years ago. And this says also something about how solid it was from the first place, that in the first real test it collapsed and fell into parts, and almost nothing left except, and this must be mentioned, except of some very courageous, devoted political groups, but they are very marginal and they are being marginalized and delegitimized in the Israeli society, but they must be mentioned. But the mainstream You know, there were years, Riz, you remember that the joke was that two Israelis share three views. Today, three Israelis hardly share one view, and this is so regrettable.
There was an interesting email that came from Somalia, if I can put this one to you, from Mahmoud Idris, who says, why are the talks taking place in the US? If they really want to mediate, they should converge on more neutral ground. Now, it's true, of course, the US is a major power broker here, but to what degree is that a valid point, that the US can't really be seen neutral from the Palestinian point of view?
And the US could have played much a bigger role. I truly believe that an American president who would really like to put an end to the Israeli occupation could have done it within months, because Israel was never, but never, so depending on the United States. Israel was never so isolated in the world, and this could have been used for a constructive goal. But unfortunately, you know, I had tears in my eyes when Obama was elected, when he held this unforgettable speech in Chicago that night. And ever since then, we get disappointed one time after the other, seeing that he's just continuing the conservative, old, bad policy of the United States in the Middle East, namely to continue with those masquerades, with those negotiations, just for a lip service, and doesn't put all his weight, which is so enormous, to bring really a change to this part of the world, a change that he is committed to.
And of course, this is one of the reasons I think you say that there's no real incentive for the Israelis to end the occupation and find peace. On that issue, you say the Israelis aren't paying any price for the injustice of occupation. Life in Israel is immeasurably better than in most countries, so occupation will never end. Now, you describe the Israelis as having a moral blindness when it comes to what's happening to the Palestinians. What do you think it would take, to create a real significant change that would help Israelis see the situation so that they might take on the view that peace is necessary?
I wish I knew the answer, you know, Riz. If I would have known the answer, I would have done something about it. The average Israeli is now much more interested in his next vacation and in his new Jeep rather than with what's happening in the backyard of his home, half an hour away from his home. And it's very, very hard to change it, because there is a whole machinery of brainwash in Israel, namely the Israeli media and the education system and all kinds of other agencies, which enable the average Israeli, to feel so good about himself, to have so very little moral doubts about what is being done on his behalf. And the occupation is even not on the agenda. It's not discussed at all. And this is really depressing.
You know, I know, of course, Gideon, you're loved and hated among Israelis for being so forthright and being so honest and straightforward in your views. And we had a viewer with a perspective that's a little different, maybe a little more optimistic, that says Palestinians and Israelis have made progress in the past and they can make peace now. And of course, your book, it's fascinating reading, hearing those personal stories. You talked about going regularly to Gaza. Was there any, in your opinion, any real progress in the past? Because Oslo failed to deliver, as you note. You waved goodbye to Gaza optimistically on that trip around the time of the Oslo Accords, and then, of course, ended up going back there, seeing things getting worse.
Yes, I think I'm so desperate many times that I really try to believe in anything. And for me, Oslo, I did believe in Oslo. Only now when I look backwards, I realize it was a bluff. And why was it a bluff? How do I know that it was a bluff? Because the real test is that did Israel intend to evacuate any kind of settlements? And this was even not discussed in Oslo. And any agreement which does not put an end to the settlements project will not last and is not an agreement. So we fall into this trap. And we gained some really lovely years. Those were lovely years, the Oslo years. But you know, it's like foam on the water. What is left out of it? Nothing.
And of course, the death toll continues, and that's something you mentioned in the book as well. And if I can quote you here on the ratio of deaths between Palestinians and Israelis, you say, the frightening balance of blood, about 100 Palestinians dead for every Israeli killed, isn't raising any questions, as if we've decided that their blood is worth 100 times less than ours, in acknowledgement of our inherent racism. Now, you say you want Israelis to be outraged by the things you write, and that you use expressions like our inherent racism. And I wonder, what do you hope when you want that kind of outrage to be generated in Israel? What do you hope it will achieve?
Many times I think I'm writing only for the archives. And many other times I think that it might touch. And how do I know that it touches? The hate mails I get. Those hate mails show me, and believe me, they are horrible. Not only wishing me cancer, but only wishing my children cancer. But this proves me that it touches some sensitive point. I would really like to prevent this luxury for the Israelis, that they will be able to claim that they didn't know. They never knew what's happening. And I'm trying really even to make them furious at me, but just to remind them, like a whistle in the darkness, just to remind them that there is an occupation, that there is a Palestinian people, and the biggest scoop for the Israelis, that the Palestinians are equal human beings exactly like us. This is hardly accepted in the Israeli society.
We have a caller from the United Kingdom. Imtiaz is on the line with us. Imtiaz, thanks for being with us. What would you like to ask?
Hello. Thank you very much for taking the call. I'd like to ask the journalist, how much influence does it think that AIPAC has on foreign policy of Obama administration? Because obviously I was listening to your comments early on that you felt that Obama administration came into power with a lot of hope, and a lot of people were expecting it to do a lot of good in the Middle East. Okay. However, it failed to aspire to it. Could you tell me how much do you think the influence Jewish lobby and AIPAC has on Obama administration?
Okay. Imtiaz, I'm going to ask Gideon to just hang on, because we have to take a short break, but we'll get an answer to your question when we return. And we'll also look at a unilateral declaration of statehood. We'll examine how Palestinians see an alternative to peace talks. Don't go away. Welcome back. A renewed effort at Middle East peace talks seems to be rising from the ashes of recent incidents that put Israelis and Palestinians even further apart. President Obama is looking to bring the two sides over to Washington, D.C. for bilateral meetings, then face-to-face talks. But considering the entrenched positions, is there anything left to negotiate? With me is Israeli author and Haaretz columnist Gideon Levy, whose new book is called The Punishment of Gaza. Just before the break there, Gideon, we had our caller in the UK, Imtiaz, asking about the influence of AIPAC and perhaps how President Obama might have been able to at least diminish that, but it seems not, he's thinking.
First of all, no doubt that the Jewish lobby has an enormous influence in the United States. But I wouldn't like to describe all the American policy as depending on the influence of the Jewish lobby. This would be an exaggeration. I don't think that the Jewish lobby, by the way, is serving the Israeli interest. By all means not, because backing the occupation is not serving the real, genuine Israeli interest. But exactly from a man like Obama, who really promised a change, from him, I would like to see much more than responding to all kind of power groups in the American society. Would it be the Jewish lobby or some Christian group or other? From him, I really was expecting to lead a change. And this change is not seen until now, at least not 1.5 years, and we don't see any change whatsoever.
Now, of course, it's interesting, looking at your writings, you've often had foreign news organizations interview you and then sometimes come back and say, well, we can't broadcast that because people might take offense. I know you had that with one French station, for example. Now, I wonder, when you look at that, how you regard that, well, how you feel, of course, that there's that kind of response, but how you regard what seems to be this kind of sanitization, perhaps censorship of some of the things that should be said.
First of all, I highly appreciate the way you read my book. You read it better than any other reader, I must say. And to the point, I don't think there is a real problem of censorship, even not in Israel, by the way. If there is a problem in Israel, it is a problem of self-censorship. In Europe, I'm mentioning one case with the French TV who wouldn't broadcast a visit of mine to Gaza after I dared to say that this is one of the moments that I'm ashamed to be an Israeli. Yes, there are moments that I'm ashamed to be an Israeli, and I'm saying it as an Israeli patriot. But altogether, I think that the European media is doing quite a fair job. Even the American media is doing not enough, maybe, to show the occupation, to show its dark side, its ugly sides, but it's doing quite a lot. The main problem is the Israeli media, who is really ignoring it.
The irony is that, we often hear that the Israeli media is very vibrant in its discussion of issues that rarely see the light of day here in, for example, the United States. People in America certainly never hear, for example, of any dissent or hear the kind of views that you put forward, that there is no real hope for Israel without some kind of genuine movement towards peace. So it seems that in the West, people don't get a real picture of what's happening. And I wonder, how you regard this, that sometimes the debate seems to be more vigorous in the Middle East than certainly it is in certainly the power corridors here of the United States and the general public here.
Yeah, I think there is a difference between Europe and the United States. I think the Europeans, those who have interest, can get a fair and full picture. As about to the United States, yes, I think that the media is biased in favor of Israel, but it's a very peculiar bias, because I don't think that those who care, who genuinely care about the future of Israel, should support the occupation. I think that real friendship toward Israel means now to raise a voice against the occupation. I think that those who really care about the future of Israel, about its nature, should have been very critical right now, and I see it very little in the American media. But I must tell you, I think there's a start of change in the American public opinion, for sure in the European public opinion. I think that Operation Cast Lead was a turning point, and after Cast Lead, at least the public opinions, if not the governments, start to be less tolerant toward Israeli attacks and violence and aggressions.
Of course, yes, there was a sense that things changed after what happened in Gaza, and I know that you write about what often was seen as the stereotype for a lot of people in the West, the Qassam rockets being fired by Hamas from Gaza out into Israel, and on this issue of the rockets, you're saying that no one maybe would have been paying attention if it hadn't been for this kind of behavior. You say that nobody would have given any thought to the fate of the people of Gaza if they had not behaved violently. That is a very bitter truth, but the first 20 years of the occupation passed quietly and we did not lift a finger to end it, which suggests really that the Palestinians can't really give up violence if they want to be heard, that they're almost forced into violence to keep their sort of issue up there in the news. Is that effectively what you're saying?
It's horrible to say it, but nobody can deny it, because the matter of fact is that all the concessions that Israel have ever done in history were always after bloodshed, never before. It goes back to peace with Egypt, which was possible only after the 73 war, and didn't take place before it, when it was possible to get to an agreement with Egypt. And it goes throughout the history. It's a horrible message that Israel is giving to the Arab world. And Gaza is the best example, because if Gaza stops launching missiles, nobody in the world cares about Gaza. The problem is that those missiles don't serve Gaza either, because when Gaza is launching the missiles, it gets cast lead, which again, so it's a lose-lose game for Gaza, and this is very unfortunate.
Now, of course, in the absence of any real result with the peace talks, there was talk of Palestinians declaring a state unilaterally, known as the Fayyad Plan. Now, of course, that's been discounted. Even Salim Fayyad, says this is not likely. But there are a lot of Palestinians that hang on to this idea of just declaring a state. What do you think would be the consequences of that?
It's all signs of despair, because declaring a state might have some international effect. I guess Europe will have to recognize this state, I guess. But on the ground there will be no change as long as the IDF, the Israeli army, is controlling the occupied territories. What meaning will it have when a Palestinian minister needs a permission from an Israeli officer to move from one town to the other? What meaning will it have? But I understand this desire to break the rules, to do something which will take us out of this vicious circle that we are in. And maybe I'm very bad, by the way, Riz, in predictions. All my predictions are always wrong. So maybe there is a room for optimism much more than I describe here.
You know, Gideon, of course, you're one of the most, you know, as I say, strong advocates for peace, with a very strong line in that you want people to understand the situation. And of course, that, as I say, that puts you in a very difficult position, proving that you're an Israeli patriot sometimes. But it's a cliche question. I have to ask you, though, do you really expect to see any kind of real, genuine peace between Israelis and Palestinians in your lifetime?
Look, first of all, we all wish ourselves long life, both to me and to you. Secondly, in this part of the world, in the Middle East, you have to be realistic enough to believe in miracles. I don't see now any scenario, any rational scenario, which leads to peace.
Okay.
But would I ask you, Riz, in the late 80s, if you see a possibility that Soviet Russia will fall, that the apartheid regime will fall, that the Berlin Wall will fall, and it all happened. Well, so maybe in our lifetime, who knows?
We'll keep our fingers crossed. God bless. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us with your questions. Be sure to become a fan of the show on Facebook. You'll find upcoming topics and previous programs there, and you can post questions for our guests. On the next show, misery compounded as millions suffer from Pakistan's worst ever flooding. Why has the international community been so slow to help? Is it donor fatigue or negative perceptions about Pakistan? Join us for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.